This is really a conversation about communications strategies. And so we have three wonderful guests who are going to help us talk through this. The first is Pranay Rajan, who is an assistant professor at Northern Arizona University. He is formerly with Purdue, and that's how we first got to know him last year. He's going to talk about, from a social scientist perspective, what drives adoption of conservation practices among farmers. And this is looking at surveys and research data that really is sort of what do we know about what drives adoption of conservation practices. And more importantly for this conversation is, and how does that inform what outreach strategies and communications should be with farmers and landowners around adoption of those conservation practices. So we are taking at first a sort of academic look. Then we are going to turn to two farmers who are going to give us an on the ground, literally sort of perspective. Both of them are conservation-minded farmers. We have Hannah Bernhardt with us from Finlayson, Minnesota. She is the owner and operator of Medicine Creek Farm, and she will talk a little bit more about her farm and what she has going on in conservation. And then we have Kyle Zweig, and I hope I pronounced that close enough, who is owner and operator of Zweig Maple Acres in Ionia, right? I pronounced that right, Wisconsin. And Kyle is also on the board of Tall Pines Conservancy. So, so I'll just leave it at that and start it off with Pranay.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, and thank you, the AFT team, for having me back. Good afternoon, good morning. It's good morning here, but I presume it's good afternoon for several of you there. So again, my name is Pranay Ranjan. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Earth and Sustainability here at Northern Arizona University. I was formerly at Purdue University. That's where a lot of this work was done. It has been a huge collaborative effort, and I have a picture of all my collaborators towards the end. So that being said, I'll get started. Today, what I'll be presenting to you is an overview of what does social science research tell us about, what motivates farmers to adopt conservation practices, and I'll talk a little bit about what does that all mean for communicating with or engaging with both landowners and farmers. So this should work. So a quick background of, why do we care? Again, it goes without saying, farmer decision-making and conservation behavior is complex. We have farmers with us and they know, it's really hard. And from an academic perspective, what we were interested in was to understand, we know that there is a lot of publications out there that have synthesized farmers' conservation behavior over the years. Some of you may have seen them, read them before. And within that background, what motivated this work was that there are very few consistent determinants of conservation practice adoption. There are some, but the idea is that they're not that consistent. And before one thing I forgot is anytime you get confused here, so I'm presenting two different studies. The first one is a qualitative research synthesis sort of findings, and the other one is quantitative. So if you get lost during the course of the presentation, just look at what we're talking about on the top. But so again, a few consistent determinants of conservation practice adoption. But over the years, what we're also seeing is that there has been an upward trend in qualitative research around farmers' conservation behavior. And given that they have not been synthesized, so a couple of questions that we posed in this study is what motivates and hinders farmers' conservation behavior? So that's one. And then what do these studies suggest for education and outreach around conservation practice adoption with farmers and landowners? Quick overview of the methods. I'll be spending a lot of my time on the results and the implications of what those results mean. But just to give you a sense of what we actually did. So Uh, the review period that we considered it ranged from 1982 to 2017, so 35 years of synthesizing literature around conservation practice adoption here in the US. So this is a US focused study. We followed what we call a three-phase search and screen process, sort of a visual of that you see on the right-hand side with me and my colleague. In the first round, we actually came across a total of 1,632 studies, which then we reviewed, in a very sort of, cursory review, which resulted in a selection of 279 studies in total, followed by a full round review by two team members, again, a visual on the side, what that looked like, which resulted in a total of 171 studies. Out of those, we further determined what is our selection criteria for qualitative studies, including things like the study had to have a qualitative data collection method. So you can imagine interviews, focus groups and things like that. And that the findings had to be presented in the form of quotes and thematic descriptions in those studies, which resulted in a total of 49 studies. So this is the number of studies that we are synthesizing during that period. And what I'm presenting today is data that has actually been published in Society of Natural Resources. I'm sure this presentation will be available to you as a resource, and which has a link to the peer-reviewed publication that you're seeing here for your reference. And this is open access, and the other one that I'll be referring to is also open access. So there's a lot of data here, but to orient you to the slide, anything that is in orange is a motivation. Anything that is in blue is the barrier. What you are seeing here on the left-hand side are sort of the overarching themes, if I may say, that emerged as we synthesized these 49 studies. So you can imagine economic factors, norms, government programs, and things like that. The N value indicates 37 is the number of studies. And what this number on the top for economic factors means is 30 of those 37 studies talked about economic factors driving conservation behavior, and 26 of those studies saying that they are, that they acted as a barrier. These numbers do not match up to 37 because, you can have one study that is both talking about economic factors motivating or hindering conservation. So just to clarify that number. So N is 37. So 37 is out of the 49. And then within the 37, 30 studies are presenting economic factors as a motivation and 26 as a barrier. So just to orient you again, the four themes that are highlighted here, economic factors, social norms, government programs, farm characteristics, are predominantly themes that are discussed in qualitative research as both motivating adoption and hindering adoption. That is what these numbers sort of indicate. So those numbers are sort of really close to each other. But as we go further down, we are seeing that there are themes or there are factors that actually are predominantly discussed in qualitative research as motivating conservation adoption. So these are motivations. So farmer characteristics, farmers being aware of environmental concerns, their trust in information sources, and those those themes. We'll dig deeper into these, so don't worry about what do you mean by farmer characteristics. We'll talk a little bit about that shortly. As we go further down, these are the themes. So themes pertaining to farm management, themes pertaining specific to the practice that you have adopted, either now adopting or you adopted in the past, risk perceptions associated with adoption of conservation practices, and land tenure. I believe a situation that several of you might actually be dealing with. So land being rented to a non-operating landowner owns the land, but they rent it to a tenant farmer to farmer. So that's the overarching sort of themes, and then an overview of factors or themes that motivate or act as a barrier for farmers to adopt conservation practices. So again, similar sort of orientation. Anytime you see a N value, that's the number of studies, and within those studies, so for example, in this case, you have 22 studies that talk about farmer identity. Within those, you have 16 that talk about stewardship identity being low or high. Every time a high stewardship identity is associated or is mentioned as motivating adoption. That's essentially what it means. So within farmer identity, what we are seeing is you have stewardship identity, farmers identifying themselves as being innovators, are again largely for motivating conservation behavior. So here's a quote from a specific study. I want to see the land preserved as much as possible so we don't farm it to death or farm it in a way that it washes away. So that is sort of representative of a farmer, sort of indicating the stewardship identity and it being high. So that is acting as a motivation. Moving on to environmental awareness, farmers' concern for the environment predominantly gets discussed in qualitative research as motivating adoption. So here's a quote from this article. If there was a practice that showed a great economic return, but yet resulted in losing nitrogen or losing nutrients or something that was really bad for water quality, I would think twice about it. So that's what this this farmer is saying in this particular study. Moving on to trust and distrust in information sources. Trust in farmers, always discussed as a motivation. So farmers being trustworthy information of sources for other farmers, farmers perceiving that watershed groups that they are part of or that they are within are trusted information sources, and that is always discussed as a motivation in terms of adopting conservation practices. So here's a quote from the study. The farmer mentioned repeatedly that the support of the other watershed group members had motivated him to implement changes that he would not have otherwise, adopted otherwise. So switching from motivations to barriers, I mentioned farm management earlier, and there are a range of sort of considerations here. So compatibility, you can imagine what I'm doing now, the practices that I'm doing now, or the operations that I have, are they compatible with the intent, with the conservation practice that I intend to adopt, for example? So that's the compatibility part. Does adoption result in increase in management effort or reduction in management effort? You can imagine that if I want to maintain things as they are, maybe there is perhaps a lesser likelihood that I would adopt something, on my farm. And of course, nobody likes, things being taxing on their time. So if adoption of a practice is resulting in increase in the time it's going to take for farmers to manage their farm, of course, it is always a barrier. So that is essentially what at least the highlighted, themes are, or what I wanted to describe. But here's a quote from the study where the author says, so years ago, again, the author is basically quoting a farmer, and the farmer said, years ago, my dad tried the no-till with the furrow irrigation, and that's a no-go. There's too much trash in the field for furrow irrigation, but with the pivot, then it's a no-brainer. So, this idea of compatibility of practices that you have on the farm. Moving on to farmers' perception of conservation practices. So in totality, what you're seeing is that these are discussed as a barrier. Are you having a good experience with current adoption of your practices, or bad, or how about prior adoption? So maybe you adopted a practice in the past and you had bad experience with that practice. Your perceptions of those practices and your experiences associated with them will either motivate you or act as a barrier for you to adopt conservation practices. So this code is substantiating a negative experience of using conservation practice and that acting as a barrier. So here's the author saying, quoting a farmer, and the farmer saying, I kept trying to fine tune no tillage and finally decided rather than doing the right thing the wrong way, I was doing the wrong thing. So, this idea that your experiences with practices will actually influence, your decision to continue to adopt them or adopt them in the future. Risk perceptions, again, any form of uncertainty, obviously, if it increases with adoption of a conservation practices, that gets predominantly discussed in adoption or in qualitative adoption literature as being a barrier. And here is a quote. There was a lot of uncertainty. Does conservation tillage really work? There you see other people using it and it can work, but does it work for your own operation? So there is some uncertainty there. So that quote is to exemplify this idea of farmers, the risk perceptions being an important driver of motivating or hindering adoption. Land tenure, again, this idea that land is leased, and some of this might actually resonate with several of you. So within a context of strong competition for land, high cash rents and annual rented contract, farmer respondents were nervous about losing access to rented ground. So again, if you don't feel if you don't think that you will actually have access to the land in the subsequent years, then the likelihood of willingness to adopt the practice goes down. So that becomes a barrier or an issue. I did not cover themes that were both discussed as motivations and barriers in the literature, but feel free to refer to the article that I was referring to. In interest of time, we'll move on to what does it all mean for education and outreach. Collaboration with community farmer leaders to build social norms and leverage trusted information seeking networks is definitely a recommendation that comes out of this study based on this idea that farmers trust other farmers, that farmer, this and trust in information sources is actually, motivating them to adopt practices. Reinforcing positive conservation practice or program experiences is also important. Again, goes back to this idea that your experiences and perception of experiences with practices will influence your behavior going forward. So this idea that if we are actually able to positively reinforce, again, if we are able to reinforce positive experiences of adopting practices, and that could help with more adoption. And again, permanence, it's not just adopting and disadopting, but it's actually staying with it. Stressing benefits adoption in terms of risk reduction is also sort of an important strategy that can be used. And then again, connecting with non-operating landowners to promote conservation behavior on rented farmland perhaps presents an opportunity to again reach out to a section of a population that is difficult to reach out to. If you are truly, if you live in a different state, it becomes really difficult to actually work with the non-operating landowner. So I'm going to switch gears from here to study 1 to study 2. We'll talk more about what do we know from quantitative research. And again, motivation was similar in the sense of there are very few consistent determinants of conservation practice adoption. But one key question we pose in this study is, perhaps that is happening because farmers, farming systems, and conservation practices are different, with respect to the primary purpose they serve, the type of benefit they provide, and whether they're operational or permanent. And here's a visual, of practices that look different, that actually entail different sort of strategies to manage them well. For some practices, you'll have to deal with them annually. For some, it's a one-time adoption. It's a more structural sort of fix that you do on your farm. So what happens, once we don't bin all the practices in one sort of container and we categorize them based on what they look, what they entail, what kind of benefits they provide, then what happens? That is essentially the underlying question that we posed in the study. So the question being, do factors that influence adoption differ by practice characteristics? And for this study, we categorize conservation practices into 4 categories. So based on their purpose, so what is their primary purpose? Are they livestock management practices? Are they nutrient management? Or are they soil management practices? What kind of benefit do they provide? Do they provide both on and off farm benefit versus primarily off farm benefit? For example, think about off farm water quality benefits. That's predominantly an off farm benefit that a practice can generate. Is a practice operational or management? Think cover crops. So you have to deal with them on an annual basis. You have to manage them on an annual basis versus they're more structural or permanent in nature. We also looked at specific conservation practices selected based on the extent of coverage in literature. So of course, we had to see if there is enough data that we can actually look for patterns. And so we selected conservation tillage, buffers, borders, soil testing and sampling is another one, grassed waterways, and then cover crops. Similar process, I'm gonna breeze through this one, but this idea that we eventually with this 3-phase search and screen process, we ended up with 126 quantitative studies that examined farmers' conservation practice adoption. We analyzed data using scientist approach and word count analysis. I'm not going to get into details of those. But again, reach out if you have any questions or read this paper that we recently published less than a month, I believe. So again, a huge team of collaborators here, and you'll see their faces towards the end of the presentation. Okay, so getting into data of a lot of data here, but to orient you to the slides again. So this on the left-hand side, the column that is in black, are the categories and the subcategories. So the category being, the big categories being attitudes, so environmental attitudes, that is what that implies, the first one there. Behaviors, economic factors, characteristics of the farm, information usage, and so on and so forth. What you see here in terms of within the column N, it's the number of, N indicates the number of observations we had for this particular analysis. How many studies that did that data come from, or did that number of observation come from? And prop basically indicates proportion of analysis where findings were consistent with our hypotheses. And anytime you see a star mark, it indicates statistical significance at 0.05 level. So again, to help you orient you to the slides, on the top you have the primary purpose. So this is the first categorization that I'm talking about. The highlighted section basically indicates that for all these categories, farm characteristics are really important. Several characteristics that are associated with the farm. However, when we look across, what we are seeing is especially important for soil management practices, or practices that primarily serve the purpose of soil management. A lot of farm characteristics or features pertaining to the farm. So greater number of acreage, having more than one crop or livestock in rotation, the number of livestock that you have, is your land vulnerable or prone to erosion? For example, is it highly erodible land, or there's a high level of gradation on your farm? Is your farm next to a water body? Those are all factors that actually drive adoption of or predict adoption of conservation practices that primarily serve the purpose of soil management. So relatively speaking, for soil management practices, farm characteristics become really, really important. So that's sort of the take-home message here, and the specific drivers. As we move from soil to nutrient management practices, you can see there are unique predictors of adoption of nutrient management practices. So behaviors such as adoption of other practices that are not directly related to nutrient management is a driver of adoption of nutrient management practices. Specifically, access to capital becomes important. Farmers' affiliation with institutions becomes important. Institutions such as, you can imagine, again, places where you hang out in terms of being affiliated with certain organizations, that also is predicting adoption of nutrient management practices. And then, of course, the higher level of formal education becomes important predictor of nutrient management practices specifically. So that's some of the key messages here. Moving on to practices that provide both on and off farm benefit, and its comparison with those that provide primarily off farm benefit. So something to consider here is access to capital becomes important for practices that provide both on and off farm benefit. However, a different economic factor or a driver, which is the overall income from the farm, becomes important in driving adoption of practices that provide primarily off-farm benefit. That's what it's showing there. And again, comparing these two over here, greater number of livestock and having farm that is next to a water body is predicting adoption of practices that primarily provide off-farm benefit, but not for practices that provide both on and off-farm benefit. And I must say, these are defined clearly. If you're wondering how did you define it, what are some examples, they are available in the paper. If you are interested, I suggest referring to that. Moving on to comparing predictors of operational management practices and permanent structural practices. Again, some sort of interesting comparison. So both attitudes are important for both adoption of operational management practices and permanent practices. However, farmers identifying themselves as stewards, as innovators, identity that is other than being financially motivated, predicted adoption of permanent or structural practices. So attitudes are also important for operational, but what we are seeing is what is more important is having a positive sort of attitude towards the program or the practice. So again, attitudes are important, but you can imagine, what you're seeing here is that they differentially sort of predict adoption depending upon the type of practice we're talking about. Going further down, economic factors are again important. However, sort of different predictors here. So you can imagine what you're seeing here is access to capital becomes really important for operational management practices. versus what factors become important for permanent practices are, income specifically from farm and the overall income from your farming up, overall income of your household in this case. So that becomes really important drivers of adoption of permanent or structural practices, as opposed to access to capital that becomes important for operational management practices. And there's an underlying sort of this idea that, again, operational practices are practices that you have to deal with on an annual basis. So, you can imagine that, that sort of requires, or in fact entails, at least you having a positive attitude towards them. Otherwise, you're less likely to actually think about them. So just wanted to clarify that sort of nuance there. Agency, oh, that's a really hard word to say, but anyways, being next to a water body, basically that's what I mean, is important for adoption of permanent or structural practices. Moving on to specific practices that we selected for this study. So you see on the top, conservation tillage, buffer or borders, soil testing and sampling, grass waterways, cover crops. Specific predictors of conservation tillage, higher level of acreage, farm growing row crops, and farm being vulnerable to, farm being vulnerable. So you have high gradation, or, it's a high erodible land that we're talking about. Those are all predictors of conservation tillage. As we move to soil testing and sampling, an assortment of attitudes and behaviors become important, as you can see over here. And then across these practices, what we are seeing is vulnerability of the farm, is sort of an important driver in terms of motivating farmers to adopt conservation practices on their farm. So we can see that effect for, grassed waterways, buffers or borders, as well as conservation tillage. And lastly, income specifically from farm emerged as a predictor for cover crop adoption. So that's just one, others did not. And of course, anytime you see a double, a sort of dash, it basically is where we did not have enough data to run the analysis. So that's something that I also wanted to point out as you make sense of this. So moving on, so actually in the paper, we do have sort of a table where we present an overview of all these factors, categorized as per primary purpose, type of benefit, operational permanency, specific conservation practices. So if you do not have the time to read everything in the paper, this table acts as a good overview of sort of, the things that I just talked about, and wanted to provide this as a reference. So what does it all mean?
Renee, I'm just going to jump in to give you a, 1 to 2 minute warning.
Sounds good. Thank you. Yeah. I'm almost done. So yeah, that's good. So overarching observation, having specific knowledge about and positive attitude towards the conservation practices, adoption of other conservation practices, seeking and using information, crop rotation, farm size. These are all drivers that are, important nearly across all of the conservation practice adoption. We found that having land that is highly erodible or has steep slopes is sort of a consistent predictor. So perhaps using a precision approach to conservation could be useful in encouraging behavior. Having knowledge specific to programs and practices is an important driver. So, of course, it bolsters the need for conservation professionals to continue education and outreach with farmers. And last but not least, so having more than one type of crop or livestock, so diversity, for example, growing beyond just corn and soybean and other crops typically that are grown together. It does support sort of recent calls that we are seeing in the ag sphere of that there is a need to increase diversity of the agricultural landscape. So these are the citations of the two studies that I just presented an overview on. Additional useful resources, references that you can refer to. And there are some additional insights from the work that I've been doing at Purdue, including an evaluation of FRPP, so which is the Federal Farm and Ranch Lands Protection Program that's coming up. And then we also have some interesting data and insights on what does success look like in farmer to farmer or peer networks, what constitutes success and what enables success in peer networks. That's something that is also coming up. Here's a nice image of the whole team that I want to definitely acknowledge. Junyu and myself, we led the second study that I was presenting data on, but it all involved this great set of folks that I've had the honor of working with. So on that note, I think I'm going to stop right there. I'm out of time. So thank you so much for your time. And please, if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer.
Thank you, Pranay. That was great. In the interest of time, if people just want to put their questions into the chat, because I do want to get on to having conversation with Hannah and Kyle. So that was the very academic, broadly speaking, what motivates farmers. And now we want to bring it down to the micro level. So I think Hannah will start with you, but it will be the same question for you and Kyle, which is, can you talk a little bit about your farm, about the conservation practices you were using on your farm, and what motivated you to take on those particular conservation practices? So Hannah, first to you and then to Kyle.
Hi, thanks for having me. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. So I'm Hannah Bernhardt. I own and operate Medicine Creek Farm in northeastern Minnesota. And I raise grass-fed beef and lamb and pastured pork and livestock guardian dog puppies. And our primary conservation practice is managed rotational grazing or adaptive grazing. And we direct market all of our products to our customers, and we deliver to the Twin Cities and Duluth. And what motivated me was that I grew up on a corn and soybean farm in southern Minnesota during the farm crisis of the 80s. And so what I saw growing up there, although most of it wasn't spoken outright, but was just kind of the tenor of the time, was that it was really a difficult way to make a living being a farmer. And so I kind of got this negative financial outlook of what it meant to be a farmer. And for that reason, I never thought that I would be a farmer. So, I went away to college on the East Coast. I had a whole nother career. And it was really only because I started doing some advocacy work for farmers and the National Young Farmers Coalition, which had just started at the time, that I started meeting farmers who were doing things differently. And what I saw was basically that farmers who were direct marketing were able to control their price, were able to get out from under the uncertainty of commodity markets where you can't control your price. And then on the other side, I saw that these young farmers were primarily using organic or sustainable or regenerative practices. And in doing so, they were able to control the price of their inputs or reduce needing to purchase inputs. And so, the kind of farming I saw growing up, it really felt like you were farming in a straitjacket because you couldn't control the price of your inputs and you couldn't control the price of your product. And so, those were kind of the two big things I saw that motivated me to think that I could farm differently and not feel so scared about the financial risks of being a farmer. And then I would also say I was highly motivated just by values in terms of environmental care and animal welfare. But had those other pieces not been there, I don't know that that would have been motivation enough for me. I think I'll stop there.
Great. That's great. Thank you so much. Kyle, same question to you.
Yeah, so I am a 7th generation dairy and crop farmer in southern Wisconsin. And I kind of have a foot in a variety of different categories. We started implementing sustainable practices at my return to our farm operation out of college. And we've been in a full no-till, 100% no-till cropping system for over a decade. We have a full nutrient management software implemented in all our acres, which is called Snap Plus. It's a UW Wisconsin developed software system. And then we utilize cover crops, a diverse crop rotation, and organic fertilizers in our production. So the unique thing about us, or about me specifically, is that I am a full-time producer, but I'm also a board member and a member of a large farmland conservancy for southern Wisconsin. So the things Pranay talked about, I get to see them kind of from multiple perspectives, which is really cool. And I think he's really accurate. He did a very good job. Motivations for me as well were my education. I attended UW-Madison for their crop and soil science specialties for a 2-year production program. And then other producers. I'm also fortunate that we're in a very progressive area of the state. We're kind of in a chain of freshwater lakes that we refer to as lake country in southeast Wisconsin. So there's a lot of people very motivated by the natural resources in the area. That, and then I think there's a misconception that sustainable practices aren't economically advantageous for producers, when in fact many are. And that, along with our area in education, were the primary motivators for myself.
Great, thank you. So there are many sort of strands to pull on, but let's talk for a minute on the challenges. So Hannah, you were focused on adaptive grazing. Kyle, it seems like you've got a long experience now with both no-till, with cover crops, doing quite a bit of innovation. But in terms of challenges that you have faced with any of these conservation practices, what kinds of challenges? And included in that, and this is where I'm especially curious, is you guys are both younger generations of families and a generation above you, in Kyle's case, multiple generations of farmers. And how has that been a challenge in any of the conservation practice adoption? So if you can speak generally about challenges, and then that sort of challenge of being a junior generation and how that is factored into decisions you've made.
Do you want me to go first, or go ahead, Hannah?
Yeah. Okay. So I think the main challenge that I kind of face currently today is time, and because I do think it takes more time to do the practices that I'm doing, at least compared to how a lot of people would be continuous grazing pastures. You know, it takes more time to set up my paddocks and move animals and kind of work with them every day. From, you know, there was definitely financial challenges. We did receive 2 EQIP grants from NRCS in order to be able to put in all of our fencing and water lines. So if we hadn't had access to that, we couldn't have grown our business. We couldn't have increased our livestock numbers. And at some point I probably would have burnt out from the amount of management time it was taking. And then from sort of the longer term perspective, so there was a challenge. At some point I did think I was going to return to my family's farmland, and I ended up in a different part of the state and buying much cheaper land, basically because of the challenges of affording prime farmland, and also accessing the capital I would have needed to start the business the way I wanted to be doing it. So I could have probably gotten, you know, an operating loan if I had wanted to do corn and soybeans like my dad, or probably even if I had just been transitioning to organic row crops. But because I wanted to specifically be raising grass-fed livestock and like needing to seed prime farmlands to pasture, that was like both a little bit way too uncomfortable for my dad, and also I don't think I could have gotten the money for that with the cost of affording that farmland. And then, you know, there is kind of the part that Pranay talked about as well, which was like the kind of maintaining the status quo with my dad and what he was comfortable with in terms of like being different from his neighbors. There was a whole process I went through of bringing him to these farmer to farmer networks, taking him to field days, conferences, seeing other farmers doing it, other farmers his age who had tried these things. And then also what was most inspiring to him was seeing other farmers his age who were passing it on to the next generation, and seeing that I wasn't the only one in the next generation who was interested in conservation practices, and that other people were going through this same kind of situation.
I love that. I can imagine that easily. Like, oh, you're not the only crazy daughter out there, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Kyle.
Yeah, things Hannah said once again, I'll kind of repeat, but obviously one of the largest challenges is that generational transfer and generational gap between the prior producer and the current. And I was fortunate enough on our own operation that my father was very, very inclined to adopt new practices, but that generally is not the case. And that's, I would say, is the primary reason that these new practices aren't adopted. Now, we also have to be honest with ourselves, and I find this very useful in our watershed group, that not every conservation practice is a success, and that there are failures. And you have to be, as a group, whether it's a conservancy or a watershed or some other form of land trust group, you have to be willing to accept that this might not work regionally, a certain technique, or it might not work for this farmer in this situation. I find that extremely useful, and just abandoning those failures relatively quickly can prevent more from occurring with other producers and having kind of a negative PR situation. Let me think about what else I was going to say right there. Another challenge that I think can occur outside of the producers is frustration in the slow nature of transformation of these things. When you're starting with as a producer, you have to change things, and it depends on your scale, but on an operational level. So if you're gonna, let's take, for example, convert to 100% no-till cropping method. That isn't just you saying you're gonna convert to 100% no-till cropping method. There's equipment changes that have to occur on the farm that cost large amounts of money and time, and changing the whole way you operate from a labor perspective, a capital perspective. It can be quite large. So, those are some of the major challenges that I look at when, you're considering implementing different methods.
Okay, that's very helpful. So let me ask you one more question, and then I will, I hope other folks have questions as well. But I think, so this training and this audience here are folks in the agricultural land protection world, right? They are not, well, most of them are not soil and water conservation district staff, or don't have deep training in conservation practices and agronomy and soil science. But they all have an interest. They're working with farmers and landowners, and they are interested in trying to promote conservation practice adoption generally, whether that's for water quality or soil health, both benefiting on farm and off farm. And I guess my question for both of you is communication is obviously key. You've both talked about that a little bit, but what strategies or suggestions would you have for folks who are showing up on a farm to both potentially monitor an easement, but to have a general conversation around conservation and soil health? And just related to that, I'm mindful of a question that was asked earlier today, or a comment that was asked earlier today by Janice, who made the point that she doesn't hear farmers talking about soil health, right? They don't use that term soil
Mhm.
health. And so the question is, if you want to be in a position of promoting soil health, how do you talk about it? Like, what if you don't say, I would like to help you improve your soil health? That's probably not a winning strategy, right? So the question is how do you start in those conversations, and what strategies would you guys suggest? And Hannah, you've been going first, so let's let Kyle go first this time.
Well, I think, Chris, soil health, that's kind of like a term. As a producer, I think you look at things on a more personal level. Your soil is your farm. It's your livelihood. So if you want to talk about soil health with a farmer, talk to them about themselves. Try to get to know them. When you come on a farm, talk to them on a personal level, because many occupations are like this. I don't mean to be specific, but this occupation is our lives. So a lot of farmers have a deep connection to their properties. So start conversations about the land they run, the things they enjoy about it, what has driven them to this. I think those are good inroads. I mentioned this on when I talked to you the other day, but I think it's worth repeating, is that in our watershed group, when we make initial contacts, we don't talk about any practices, nothing. You have to start a relationship with that farmer and build trust. And then down the road, you can kind of take, in my opinion, a drip approach, just slow, steady, bits of information after that relationship is built. I think one of the most offensive things to producers can be a snap judgment made by somebody coming on a property and maybe saying something that wasn't well thought out, or didn't have a lot of scientific or educational background. And that can ruin an organization with a number of producers that are friends for a decade. It can ruin the image of that organization for a long period of time. So it has to be a very calculated and thought out process, in my viewpoint.
Great, thank you. Hannah?
Yeah, I think I would say the same thing, is approaching it not as like this didactic thing here, you should learn about soil health, but kind of asking the farmer like what's going well for them and what their challenges are, and bringing it up more as a response to, this is a way to maybe work with this challenge. And at the same time, acknowledging, what is working for them, and sort of, not ignoring that, because they will have some pride in their operation and how they're doing things. But, Pranay did mention like the actual like farm operation, like how it's going, like how it works is huge to implementing these practices. And so getting an understanding of like what they're actually doing, how their operation is functioning now, is time management one of their biggest challenges. And then one thing I tend to also lean towards is like, without talking about climate change, a lot of farmers will talk about the challenges of the weather, and will say, whether it's drought or extreme storms and extreme rainfall events. This is something that I think a lot of farmers have anxiety about and feel a lack of control over. And that can be one way to start talking about soil health in increasing the water holding capacity of their soils to make them more resilient to both drought and storms. And, it's a tricky conversation to have when we're talking about climate change, but to kind of make it more about resiliency and gaining back some control over extreme weather is one thing I think can be possible.
Chris, can I just say one other thing regarding kind of an organizational structure around this topic? I'm assuming that's a yes. I know a lot of you guys are from different organizations, so this may be useful, maybe it won't, but I'll say it anyways. We found, or our organizations have found, so you have the land trust, that's a very rigid structure, you know, a nonprofit, typically accredited. And then that type of organization, if you have a rep or some employee coming directly from that, can once in a while be a little intimidating. So Tall Pines, our conservancy, recognized that and said, well, we're going to put a watershed group under our umbrella financially, but we're going to kind of pack that with producers and one more specially trained individual, kind of from especially trained in PR and relationship building, to be the contact that's directly out with those farmers, so that you can build that you know, one guy that everybody kind of knows out in the community, versus this rotating board of directors or executive director through the conservancy. You know, that it's almost viewed by producers as kind of another governmental agency, which, you know, is not bad. I don't view as bad, but there's just kind of that hierarchy that can be a little bit negative. So I just thought I'd mention that, Chris. Sorry if that was off topic.
No, that was very helpful, and I'm sorry I missed a tiny bit of it because I got kicked out of the session, or maybe I hit a wrong button. That was really helpful. I want to open it up for people, so please raise your hand if you have a question or comment, because really other thoughts and perspectives would be great in here. But Kyle, I think that last point that you made, I do know of a couple of land trusts who really rely and have worked hard to have farmers, often retired farmers, who were doing stewardship visits. And that is very intentional, because they want those relationships to be farmer to farmer, as opposed to a paid professional stewardship staff. Now, I know that doesn't work for everybody, right? But it is an approach that I think, I like your idea of having that sort of person that is the forward facing one, being somebody who is a farmer, former farmer, somebody with that kind of credibility, particularly on the ground. Did people have thoughts, comments, either for Hannah or Kyle or Pranay?
I could just add to, while people are thinking of their questions, that I would emphasize the farmer to farmer networks too. Like, if you're pointing people towards resources, before you point them to you know, extension or NRCS, I would point them to field days on nearby farms. And, you know, I think like Practical Farmers of Iowa is an organization I love. And also, because of their name, it's so approachable. It doesn't even like say sustainable farming, you know, organic farming. It's like, no, these are practical solutions to problems farmers are facing. And that makes pretty much anyone feel like they can go to that field day and, you know, not feel strange being there.
That's a really great point. That's a great point. And I think the point that you made earlier, Hannah, of that for your father to see farmers of like age, that it's not just going to a field day, but it's a field day where somebody feels like the other farmers look like them. And that sort of age, that age makes a difference significantly. Anyone? Thoughts, questions?
Sorry.
Right ahead.
It's something that keeps going through my head when I understand that like the farmer to farmer conversation has a lot of power, and that soil health days, and like you said, Hannah, just now, practical farmers of Iowa. And I'm not a farmer, and maybe it's a common sense answer, but how do you find those? How do you find the farmer that's good peer to peer? How do you, like, do you just have to plug in? Do you have associations that you belong to? Like, how do you get information about those opportunities? Anybody in the room, Kyle or Hannah?
I mean, yeah, I'm members of all these organizations. Even though I'm in northern Minnesota, I'm a member of Practical Farmers of Iowa, but I'm also a member of the Land Stewardship Project and the Sustainable Farming Association and the Young Farmers Coalition. But there are, those are obviously conservation-minded organizations. So that's not going to be the way that everyone's finding out about them. But for you guys, that's certainly a way to find out about more of these soil health events. I do feel like the Sustainable Farming Association does a really good job of having approachable field days and really good instructors.
Great. Brian.
Yeah, I was just going to add, as far as some of the workshops and what's available out there, if you're a member of your local soil and water conservation district, they often put out information on those workshops, and it's a good way to meet some of the local farmers through that as well. And one last thing, this has been excellent. Thank you to the three of you. I feel like you have really hit at the core of some of these issues that we have when we're working with farm tenants especially on land we own. So this has been wonderful. Thank you.
Great. Well, yes, thank you. I echo those thanks. And Kyle, Hannah, Pranay, any last parting thoughts from any of you?
I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm glad to hear that it was helpful. It's a great validation to hear that actually farmers resonate. I mean, our findings actually resonate with farmers. So I appreciate Kyle and Hannah for, that sort of, it's the research is it is only as good as it is useful and usable for, people who are out there. So I appreciate all such opportunities. So thank you so much for having me.
Great. Well, thank you. Kyle?
Yeah, if there's anything that any of you would want to ask privately, you can connect with Chris, and she could forward my contact information, or I'm sure Hannah's as well. She wouldn't mind. And you feel free to reach out. I mean, I think I can safely speak for the three of us when I say that we're all passionate about conservation. It may look differently it may look slightly different in our operations, but we're all focused on it one way or another.
Great. And Hannah?
Yeah, same. It was great to hear Pranay's research as well, just because I took a bunch of notes because I am constantly thinking about this, like, how do we get more people to adopt these practices? And it's helpful to have that to kind of back up and think through my own personal experiences and how it resonates. But yeah, please feel free to reach out. And also, if you have any questions about working with NRCS's EQIP grants, that's one thing too I could talk to people more about.